Hello, and thanks for giving up some of what looks as if it's going to be a wonderfully warm Saturday morning to come and listen to me. I also want to say thank you to Janet and all the others who've organised the Hackney History Festival. It is a fantastic initiative. It's obviously being well supported, and I just think it's sort of, in terms of a venue, this is fairly spectacular, and Sutton House tomorrow is every bit as good. So I just feel very pleased to be here. I know Janet mentioned there'd been just a little bit of pushback, that there's a talk at the Hackney History Festival which is about Sidney Street, which is not in Hackney, but it's the other side of the Mile End Road. So sorry? Okay, well, I daren't mention that I live in Kentish Town, so just regard that as unsaid. But there is a Hackney link, so there was a trial arising out of the robbery which preceded Sidney Street, which was a triple police murder, and then Sidney Street itself. And one of the people who was a defendant, he was acquitted, was a guy called John Rosen, who was a Latvian anarchist, who was a barber, who lived above the shop in Mare Street. So Hackney has got a place in this story. I've written a book about Sidney Street, and of course I've got copies if anybody would like to see them. And I've described it as the most sensational shootout in London's history, which of course is a sensational way of introducing the subject. But I also think it's borne out, and it was sensational in all sorts of ways. It was, it attracted a huge amount of attention in the media. This pamphlet was put together within 3 days of the Siege of Sidney Street by the Daily Chronicle. A penny pamphlet, the only complete account of the Houndsditch tragedies and the historic siege of foreign anarchists in the East End of London. And it was stuffed full of reports from the Daily Chronicle and of news photographs they'd taken. And as you can see there, you've got a very dramatic silhouetted photograph on their front page. One of the reasons why the Siege of Sidney Street was sensational is because the popular press was just coming into its element. Papers selling for a penny or a halfpenny, using new printing techniques, and able to put action photographs rather than simply portrait photographs or line drawings on their front page. But I ought to tell you what the Siege of Sidney Street was and when it was. 3rd of January 1911. In the words of the Home Secretary of the time, and I'll say more a little about him in a bit, he said at the time, nothing of the sort had been seen within living memory in quiet, law-abiding, comfortable England. Well, set aside the sort of cloying lyricism of that. He was, in essence, right. Nothing of the sort had been seen. A 6-hour shootout in the streets of the East End, which involved two, well, the shorthand is Latvian anarchists. One of them was a Latvian anarchist, one of them was a Russian and probably not an anarchist, and armed police and the army. 6 hours it lasted, probably 1,000 bullets being fired one direction and another. And it only ended when the building in which the two men were seeking refuge, the besieged house on Sidney Street, caught fire. And it followed directly on from an attempted armed robbery by a group of Latvians on a jeweller's shop in Houndsditch 2 weeks earlier, which led to what remains the most grievous incident in the history of the London police. The Latvians shot their way out when they were disturbed by the police, and they shot dead 3 police officers and seriously wounded 2 others. And it was 2 of the men who were wanted for that police murder who were hiding in Sidney Street and who were in the besieged house. So I mentioned that this happened just as the popular press was starting to find its feet and taking advantage of new forms of photography, new forms of printing. It also happened as an absolutely new news medium was taking root here. So newsreels, silent inevitably at that time, had only started showing in theatres, which was the word then used for cinemas, a few months earlier. But when there was a shootout in the East End, 5 cinematographers took their cameras and got footage of the Siege of Sidney Street. Of those 5, The films of 3 of those cinematographers happily survive. You can find them on YouTube. And some of that film was being shown in theatres in central London that same evening. So before the debris of Sidney Street had actually gone cold. I mentioned the Home Secretary who wrote so lyrically about Sidney Street. And now, that's him. Top hat. You recognise him, I hope. Winston Churchill, then 35, a Home Secretary in a Liberal government. Important to remember that. He was not a Conservative at this time. He saw himself as a reforming Home Secretary. He also saw himself as a man of action. He'd fought and killed in Sudan. He'd been a war correspondent, which actually in that case meant a combatant as well, during the Boer War in South Africa. And when the Siege of Sidney Street broke out, as Home Secretary, he could find very little out from Scotland Yard about what was happening. So what did he do? He went to the scene. This is, of course, completely upending the operational chain of command. There are already 2 police forces involved, and troops, and the fire brigade, and then the political boss comes along and everybody's wondering who's in charge. Churchill insisted, I was not there to direct operations. But journalists who were within a few feet of him heard him perpetually giving directions. Go there, come back. And also, he liked just to be a little bit closer to the action than prudence would dictate. He wanted to be seen to be a risk taker. And he directly told the fire brigade when the building caught fire, don't put out the flames. There's absolutely no doubt about that. He justified it on the grounds of the safety of the fire officers. There are obviously other reasons why he didn't want to put out the flames. This is the other guy who's most associated with the Siege of Sidney Street, almost as well dressed as Winston Churchill. I don't know if you could put a name to him. That's Peter the Painter. He was a Latvian and an anarchist, and one of the group who were involved in organising almost certainly organising the robbery that went wrong of the jeweller's shop in Houndsditch. This was a photograph that the London police got from the police in Marseille. Peter the Painter was a Latvian, but he'd spent time in the States and in France before he came to London. He'd only been in London for a matter of weeks at the time of the Siege of Sidney Street. And wow, what a smart guy with that sort of Hercule Poirot moustache and, you know, the whole demeanour of it, studio portrait photograph. He was quite something. But he wasn't at Houndsditch and he wasn't at Sidney Street. So the myth of Peter the Painter, the man who escaped from the besieged burning building, simply isn't true. But he was one of the most prominent Latvian anarchists, a key figure in the group responsible. And he probably was here to take either the jewels, the stolen jewels, or if they had a fence, the money that was raised from it, out of the country to, well, some of it out of the country, to help fund the Latvian resistance movement. And I'm going to say more about that as well in just a moment. This is the poster. Oh, I've gone too far. This is the poster that the police put out of Peter the Painter. At that stage, they only knew one of his pseudonyms, Peter Piatkov. Posters were put out in English, Russian, and Yiddish. £500 in December 1910 would be the equivalent of £60,000 today, so a decent sum. But they didn't get him, and they never got him. But we do have some photographs of other of the Latvian anarchists, and this is a particularly striking photograph. These are a group of Latvian anarchists, a photograph provided by the Latvian police to the British consul in the Latvian capital, Riga, who sent it on to the London police. 2 of these, those 2, were in London at various times, and as you can see, just the sort of the mood music of the photograph. And there are quite a lot of photographs, actually, of Latvian anarchists, which were seized by the police when they searched the rooms of suspects in the aftermath of the robbery in Sidney Street. Really rather confident, well-dressed. The Latvian resistance movement was a movement of educated youngsters. It wasn't sometimes people imagine anarchism to be a sort of lumpen movement, the dispossessed. These guys, as you can tell, were not dispossessed. And while it was mainly a male movement, there were a significant number of women who were involved, including in London. So why did Latvians resort to armed robbery? Well, in 1905, there was an attempted revolution in Russia. There was also an attempt in revolution in Latvia, which was part of the Russian Empire. And indeed, in Latvia, it was a very active movement, which was leftist, largely social democrat, which in the parlance of the time meant Marxist, but also in part nationalist, resisting both rule by the Tsar in Moscow, or actually at the time in St. Petersburg, and also German domination. The aristocracy in rural Riga was Lutheran and German speaking. And it was a very vigorous movement, which was also vigorously contested. So in one of the biggest demonstrations in the Latvian capital in 1905, the demonstration was dispersed by security forces opening fire. And a lot of the demonstrators, to get away from the gunfire, went on to the ice-covered river that runs through Riga. The ice cracked, and it's believed that more than 200 of the demonstrators drowned. And there remains a huge Soviet-era monument to those protesters. And the Tsar's government sent Cossacks in to pacify Latvia, which was a fairly prosperous area, quite small, population today about 2 million. And there was a great deal of arbitrary execution, a lot of torture, and some sexual violence as well. And young Latvians thought the only way in which they could resist this movement was by taking up arms to match the weapons used against them by the security forces. And they tended to buy good weapons. They bought on the black market in Helsinki or Antwerp or elsewhere, they bought semi-automatic pistols, really effective weapons. And they weren't very well trained, but they were actually organized into sorts of militias. And the anarchist movement within Latvia developed from 1905 to 1906 as a more left-wing and militant current. When the Tsar introduced reforms and said we're going to have elections, some of the social democrats said, okay, we'll try that out. We'll go for the ballot box. The anarchists basically said, no, we're not going to go into electoral politics. We're not going to start having a dialogue with the authorities. We're going to fight. Whether that's right or wrong is another matter, but that's what they said. And they also believed, and the Social Democrats did too, that staging armed robberies, robberies of banks, payroll robberies to fund their movement was absolutely politically justified. And in some cases, it wasn't just to fund their movement or to buy weapons, it was to keep themselves going as well. So Lenin at one stage said that revolutionary expropriation is entirely justified, though he added, as long as it has the sanction of the party. Well, as far as the anarchists were concerned, the sanction of the party was not needed. But a few of the Latvians in exile, probably about 2,500 young Latvians went into exile because of the nature of the repression. A few of them retained a loyalty to anarchism and brought their guns with them and operated in the same way in exile as they had done in Latvia. In other words, staged armed crime to sustain themselves and their movement. Remember, they spoke Latvian, they would have spoken Russian, they may have spoken some German, some of them would have spoken Yiddish, but they didn't have very much English and didn't learn very much English. So actually they were almost cocooned when they were in London or Glasgow or Philadelphia or Paris or Marseille. They had very little, by and large, they had very little contact with what you might call homegrown left-wing political movements. There was already, just talking about that to Rod, there was already in the East End of London a very powerful anarchist movement, led by this guy, Rudolf Rocker. In 1906, they acquired a disused church as their club, top right in Jubilee Street, and they had a weekly paper, Der Arbeiterfreund, in Yiddish, translates as the worker's friend. You can tell from the typography, there's a certain modernism and jauntiness there. This is not just another tired political paper. And Der Arbeiterfreund had a print run in London of 4,000 copies a week. So, not bad. The Jubilee Street Club was a home to anybody who came from Eastern Europe who was progressive in their politics. It's a club with membership, but non-members were allowed in. And although Rocker and his comrades were against political violence, they were against expropriation, they were against armed robbery, the Latvians who were involved congregated at the Jubilee Street Club. They went to meetings there, they ate in its cafe, they read Russian and Latvian papers in its library. It was the epicenter. And for this reason, they were often associated as part of Rocker's anarchist movement, even though that was not entirely accurate. This is the jewellery shop in Houndsditch, Harris's, which the Latvians decided in December 1910 that they were going to rob. There was a safe in the back of it. The safe had items worth in today's money about £1 million in it. So actually, this is quite a big sum. There had been other robberies that had gone wrong, which Latvians had been involved in, notably one in Tottenham the previous year, the Tottenham outrage, where two armed Latvian anarchists grabbed a wages bag full of wages money being delivered to a rubber reclamation factory just off Tottenham High Street. They got the money. They hadn't planned it very well. The factory was immediately opposite Tottenham Police Station. Worse than that, Tottenham Police Station had a section house on the top floor, which is where a lot of young unmarried police officers would lodge. So when the commotion was heard, the police tumbled out of doors and windows from the police station and set off in pursuit of the two robbers who were carrying, there were no pound notes at that time, carrying a very heavy bag of £80 worth, £80 in old prices of cash. And it became a little bit of a carnival. Everybody joined in the chase, with the Latvians running and every so often turning around and firing a few shots to try and warn off their pursuers. That led to a chase all the way across Tottenham Marshes, right to the other side of the Lee Valley, into Walthamstow, where the two armed Latvians hijacked first a tram, which led the police to commandeer another tram, which they ordered to go, I mean, this is true, they ordered to go in reverse to pursue the original tram. Then when that wasn't working, the Latvians jumped off and they hijacked first a milk cart, but couldn't disengage the brake, and then a vegetable seller's cart. So it's a farce, isn't it? Except 4 people died. Both the Latvians died, and they shot dead a police officer and a bystander in Tottenham, a 10-year-old boy. The police officer has a very grand grave in Abney Park, which is another Hackney angle to the story. So the Latvian anarchists in London had form. Here, what they did was much more sophisticated. They had they excavated in from the back of the jeweller's store. This is Exchange Buildings, then a cul-de-sac. This side of it backed on to Houndsditch, and just so happens that you see the young woman who's peering out of a window. That house, it was 3-storey, but only a small single room on each storey with an outside loo at the back. That house was rented by the anarchists, legally, so that they could use it as a base to burrow in through the back wall of the jeweller's shop and get to the safe. And that's what they did. Though it was dreadfully inconvenient because they ended up burrowing through the outside toilet of the House and Exchange buildings to try and get into the jeweller's store. They had cutting equipment and they had a very large gas canister supplied unwittingly by Enrico Malatesta, the Italian anarchist then living in London, who the group had met at the Jubilee Street Club and who rather innocently agreed to provide this gas canister. At least that is what he told the police. And I have to say the police believed him. But, you know, so, I mean, some things change, don't they? But so they had a plan. And then bits of it were well prepared, bits of it weren't. So they started burrowing in. This was a Jewish area. And the businesses were closed from Friday afternoon to Sunday morning. They started burrowing in about 9 o'clock on a Friday evening, thinking that they probably had 36 hours to get into the building, crack the safe, get everything out of it, and scarper. But actually, it's very quiet in Jewish areas, devout Jewish areas, when it's the Sabbath. So, you know, clink, 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 clink. One of the neighbours noticed, and at 10:30 on a Friday evening, went out looking for a uniformed police officer. It was still the days where actually if you went out on a Friday evening into the street, you had a good chance of meeting a uniformed police officer. And he did. And this police constable realised that the noise, which he'd listened to quite intently, was coming from this building and Exchange buildings. So he went to the door and knocked. He was a fairly junior police officer, and having knocked, he couldn't work out what to say. He couldn't really say, "Are you robbing that jeweller shop?" So he said, "Is the missus in?" to the man who answered the door. I mean, he knew there was a woman had been seen in the house. And the man who opened the door said, "No." And so the police constable said, "OK, I'll come back another time," and disappeared back to Bishopsgate police station and alerted the police station that it looked like there was a robbery underway. Remarkably, even though, you know, surely the would-be robbers had realised that they were in danger of being busted, they carried on trying to get through the wall. In fact, they had broadly got through the layers of brick. They'd reached the woodwork on the far side of the wall. So they were almost into the jeweller's shop. But about 11:30 at night, 9 police officers came to the area from Bishopsgate police station, none of them armed. One of the sergeants knocked on the door of the House and Exchange buildings. One of the Latvian men came to the door. He opened the door and then retreated back into the building. The police officer ventured through the door. Somebody came down the stairs of the building, shot the sergeant dead. And then the whole group of Latvians stormed out. It was a cul-de-sac, so the only way out they'd got was down there, and that's exactly what they did. There were at least 3 semi-automatic pistols used, and they shot fairly wildly, killing, as I say, 3 police officers and seriously injuring 2 others. And when I say it's the most serious incident in the annals of the London police, it is. There was one occasion, you probably know the name, some of you may have known the name, Harry Roberts. There was one occasion where 3 police officers were shot dead, but no other occasion when you've got 3 dead and 2 so seriously injured that they could never return to their police duties. So the robbery had been forestalled, but the police the police's first priority, of course, was to get their own officers medical treatment. And it caused a huge sensation. So this is one of many, many mourning cards which were printed and basically peddled for 3pence or 6pence to the memory of the 3 police officers. The 2 sergeants are buried in rather imposing graves at the City of London Cemetery in Ilford. Their funeral service was at St Paul's. Winston Churchill and his new wife Clementine were among those who attended. It was a moment of national shock, and a moment to actually honour the bravery of the police, who had been, you could perhaps say reckless, but they'd also been very courageous in trying to stop a robbery, aware that there was a possibility that the robbers were armed and they had no guns. But amid all the confusion, as the Latvians were making their escape, they got very powerful weapons. I'm not sure that they knew how to use them to best effect. The gang shot one of their own, George Gardstein, probably the guy that had done most of the organising of the gang. Certainly the one who had arranged with Malatesta for the use of the gas canister. He died the following day. He was carried back by his comrades to not to his own house, that was too far away, but to an associate's house, actually where Peter the Painter was staying, in a back street in Whitechapel. And he died the following morning, and the police found his body. And the police took these rather, I'll say gruesome, it looks quite peaceful, but these are of course post-mortem photographs, which the police circulated to try and get information about him and his associates. The other thing that the police said about Gardstein, and of course they didn't see him until he was dead, was how handsome he was. This is one of the photographs that was found in Gardstein's room. I'm not absolutely sure whether that's Gardstein on the right, but if it's not, it's somebody who looks very much like him. Tall, dapper, well-dressed. Who's that on the left? I don't know, but I don't think it's his sister. Gardstein actually had a reputation as a womanizer. A lot of the anarchists, including Rocker and his comrades, believed in the concept of free love, but actually in their personal lives, they were quite conventional. Gardstein was a love 'em and leave 'em type, and actually Rudolf Rocker and others censured him after his death publicly for the way in which he behaved towards women in the movement. But there is a wonderful description there was a guy called Arthur Harding, who was a lifelong East End criminal, who was interviewed towards the end of his life by the social historian Raphael Samuel. Arthur Harding, not Jewish, well, if it was political, it certainly wasn't on the left. He remembered Gardstein and the gang of Jewish, well, he saw them as criminals, walking along Brick Lane and neighbouring areas. And he gave a rather dramatic sort of visual memory of them, that they would be a gang of 12 or 15 of them. They would always walk in the centre of the road. He was rather admiring of them particularly because they had women in the group and the women were good lookers. So he really made a mark on how Harding viewed them. He also viewed them rather sympathetically because the word was they were fighting the police. They were fighting the police in Latvia, but actually fighting the police wherever you're fighting the police, as far as Arthur Harding was concerned, was quite a good thing. So, in the aftermath of the triple police murder, basically the people responsible got out. Peter the Painter almost certainly got out to the Netherlands by sea within 48 hours. Another of the group probably got out to France maybe that same evening. Another, John Rosen, who actually was the Hackney barber, he got out to Antwerp. The woman who was centrally involved and who had been present at Houndsditch when the shots were fired, a woman called Nina Vasilyeva, she tried to get to Paris but failed and then came back and hid in London. But two of the gang, who were quite certainly present when the shots were fired and very probably were directly implicated in the police murders, went to ground much more close at hand. They hid in the second floor room of 100 Sidney Street, which was the home of the lover of one of the two men. And they probably hid there for a couple of weeks, without attracting attention. But after a couple of weeks, they really thought they needed to find somewhere new to hide. And they got in touch with a comrade and asked him to organise them a new place to hide. That comrade was an informer. I don't think he was a police informer of long standing, but at any rate, he informed to the police where these two men were hiding. Just maybe a day or two before the police surrounded 100 Sidney Street, one of the two men, Fritz Spars, who was a Latvian anarchist, wrote a letter back to his family in Latvia, telling them the predicament he was in. I'm just going to quote from that. In this letter, handwritten in Latvian, he says to his family, quote, 2 weeks I've been on the run. How much longer I can manage, I don't know. To leave soon doesn't bear thinking about because they're guarding all the roads intensely. I'm not at all depressed because everyone knows that one has to die at some time. Okay, so he knew what was coming. He gave this letter to pass on to his family to the same guy that was helping them find a new place, the informer. This letter didn't get any further than the police and is now in the London Metropolitan Archives. It never reached his family in Latvia until... Strange how things work. So when I was researching the book, the wife of a good friend was a Latvian speaker. She was helping me with translating inscriptions and photographs and things like that. And she was back in Latvia last summer selling a flat. And she was chatting to the woman who was, the estate agent. And she realised that, this woman said, oh, one of my forebears was a rebel in London back in the, they only found out about it in the post-Soviet period because in the Soviet period you didn't talk about having, rebel armed anarchist antecedents. And it turned out that the antecedent was Fritz Spars, the guy who wrote the letter. I went over, I'd finished writing the book and I'd done all the research, and the publishers wouldn't let me add an appendix. It's just one of those things that just... But Margarita is the great-granddaughter of Fritz Spars' sister. And Leona is the estate agent and Margarita's daughter. So I gave them a copy of the 8-page handwritten letter, which they found quite difficult to read because it's a slightly archaic form of Latvian. They were very pleased to have it, and they're neither embarrassed or proud of their forebear, but they're quite pleased that they know a little bit more about him. So, by 7 o'clock in the morning of the 3rd of January 1911, police had surrounded 100 Sidney Street and all the area around. Just after 7 o'clock, one of the police officers threw gravel at the window that they believed the two men were in. Having managed, and this is quite remarkable really, the police managed to get everybody else out of the besieged house, leaving just the two Latvians in. Whether the Latvians were aware of what was happening, I don't know. They even managed to get one of the Latvians' partners out on a little bit of acting on their part, but nevertheless they managed to do it. So only the two Latvians were in there. They threw the gravel at the window, and a volley of shots was the reply. And that was the beginning of a protracted gun battle. The police had got about 20 men there who had weapons, fairly motley selection, some old shotguns, rifles, a few have got pistols. None had automatic pistols. So the two gunmen in Sidney Street were effectively much better armed than the police who were trying to winkle them out. And of course the big thing for the police is as soon as the shootout started, a crowd gathered. So throughout the day, the crowd got larger and larger, eventually measuring in the tens of thousands. And many more police were involved in crowd control duties than there were in winkling out the two gunmen. And you can see here I mean, there are not only huge crowds, but every balcony and vantage point is being taken. And of course, when news of the shootout reached Fleet Street, which was fairly prompt, how often do Fleet Street journalists have a chance of seeing part of the action of a breaking news story? And Sidney Street's only 3 miles away. So a whole barrage, is a barrage the right collective now? I'm a former news journalist myself, I'd better think of a better collective now. A whole barrage of journalists rushed to Sidney Street, and they managed to get access to a vantage point on the top of a pub overlooking 100 Sidney Street. The publican there demanded a sovereign for each journalist who went up there. I reckon there were at least 20, so by today's money he made £2,500 simply by allowing a group of journalists on access to his roof. But one of the people who went up there was one of the news camera operators, so we've got actually footage from that vantage point which has survived. By 10 o'clock, the police realised they were losing. They were just not getting anywhere. The gunmen had the run of the house, front and back, and there was lace curtains in all the windows. You couldn't see their silhouettes, so they were firing, from all over the place. One police officer was seriously injured. So the police, with the permission of the Ministry of War, asked the army to help. The police actually went in person to the Tower of London and asked for a detachment of Scots Guards to come. These are Scots Guards. 20 armed Scots Guards marched from the Tower of London to Stepney, causing an absolute sensation. It was the first time that the army had been deployed and opened fire in support of the police in London for almost a century. It happened in the immediate aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. And as far as I can make out, and I've dug away at this, it didn't happen again until the Iranian embassy siege of 1980. So it didn't happen again for another 70 years. So it's just a remarkable event. Army being called in to support the police and opening fire in support of the police in London. Here we've got this Churchill who rushed to the scene. He gave, after the event, approval as Home Secretary. He was in the bath when the call came saying, are you okay with this? But by the time he was asked, the troops were already on their way to Stepney. It's a wonderful photograph. This became a postcard, widely circulated. You've got Churchill towards the front there, but it's the guy who's sitting above, waving to the camera. What is the story behind that guy? Who is he? It's really his photograph. And sometimes it was cropped out, which I just think is almost criminal, but it is just such a wonderful image. So you've got police, you've got Scots Guards, and even though the Scots Guards were issued with rifles and they had good vantage points, they took over the house opposite, they stationed themselves in the tower of a bottling plant, of a brewery, which gave them a higher vantage point overlooking Sidney Street. The gun battle continued. It'd go quiet for 10 or 15 minutes, then there'd be quite an active exchange of fire. And that continued for so long that somebody, Churchill says it wasn't him, took the extraordinary step of asking for machine guns to be set up on the streets of East London and calling in field artillery from St John's Wood. So 3 big pieces of field artillery with ammunition were taken by horse all the way from St John's Wood to Stepney. I should make clear the machine guns and the field artillery were not used, they never opened fire, but I think it's the only occasion that machine guns and field artillery have been deployed in a hostile manner on the streets of London. But what curtailed that is about 1 o'clock, some smoke was seen rising from the besieged building. Just wisps of smoke initially. By 1:30, flames were also emerging from some of the windows, and the building was fully ablaze. How did the fire start? You tell me. When the fire brigade turned up, Winston Churchill personally instructed them not to try and douse the flames. He said after the event that it was because he didn't want more lives to be lost at the hands of these rogues. There were other ways of dealing with them. Clearly, there's, the security forces were desperate to end the siege before nightfall, which would have been about 4 o'clock. So, and the first fire brigade officers on the scene were told by police that the police were firing out, their words, burglars, with the clear implication that the police started the blaze. The newspapers the following day reported that the police started the fire. And to be honest, they reported that neutrally, not with any sense of shock or criticism, but it's just what they believed happened. The Home Office then issued a statement saying that was categorically untrue, and the official version is that cause unspecified, but probably a bullet rupturing a gas main, which is entirely possible. But there was a very angry meeting the next morning between the head of the Metropolitan Police and the head of the London Fire Brigade, because the fire brigade reporting that they'd been told by the police they were firing out burglars clearly suggested that the police had started the blaze, and the commissioner of the police was unhappy that this got into the public domain. The firing from the building stopped at about 2 o'clock. About 2:30, the blaze had been sufficiently combated that fire officers entered the back of the building. They found one body. It took them several hours to realise that there was also a second body on the debris. And in recovering debris and looking for the guns as well as the bodies, one fire officer was trapped under a collapsing hearthstone from the floor above and suffered injuries from which he died 6 months later. He's buried in Highgate Cemetery. That was the only casualty related to the Siege of Sidney Street apart from the 2 gunmen. One had been shot dead, the other died of smoke inhalation. So the decision not to douse the flames did cost the life of one of those gunmen. For the papers, it was just a sensational story. And the evening papers were, the evening news was on the desk of the Home Office officials, first edition, by 11:30 in the morning. The closing editions of the evening papers on the 3rd of January had photographs of Sidney Street on their front page. The next morning, the Daily Mirror had 20 photographs of or about Sidney Street in that edition, including, as you can see, one that took up the whole front page. The Times put the story on page 8, but, yeah, what can you say? It also led to a really poisonous expression of anti-Semitism in the nationwide media. Most of the Latvians were not Jewish. Some were. But because they were seen as from the Jewish East End, Stepney at that stage was probably more than 2/3 Jewish. And Sidney Street, that block of houses, I've looked at the census returns, in 1911, block of 8 houses, everybody there was of East European antecedents, apart from 2 young women who were live-in servants. This was an extraordinarily Jewish area. But this appeared as a cartoon in The People, Sunday newspaper. Rats labelled undesirable alien. Alien was the common word used for impoverished Jewish migrants escaping pogroms in Eastern Europe. And they're being expelled from a foreign country. There's a foreign official ordering them out. And they're entering Britain. Clearly they've got Semitic features. And they're ordering Britain through gaps in a gate labelled Aliens Act. There was a 1905 Conservative Act, which was the first attempt to limit mass immigration into the country. It wasn't terribly effective, and the message of this, of course, is we need a proper way of stopping these people. The same edition of The People also printed a doggerel poem, which for a mainstream newspaper must be the most poisonous piece of anti-Semitism that's ever appeared. It called for the immediate expulsion from Britain of every Jew without exception. Clear them all out, clear them all out. Now, that was on one end of the spectrum, but there was a mounting public and political disquiet about mass immigration, and about, I mean, you can hear the current resonance, can't you? And about these bad guys who are coming in and they're causing all sorts of problems here, and they don't understand the way that we do things here, and look, it's all going to hell in a handcart. The Liberal government, of which Churchill was part, was actually rather clever. They let the campaign burn itself out. So there was no tightening of the Aliens Act. There was no erosion of the right of asylum. The only policy change was to make sure that there were better weapons available for the police in London when they needed to use firearms in dealing with armed crime. This is Nina Vasilieva. This is her arrest photograph. She was present at Houndsditch. This is the last slide. I just love this photograph because of that glower. The police tried to deport her. She was the only person convicted arising out of the police murders, though only for conspiracy to rob. She was cleared on appeal. So she only spent a few weeks in, a few months in jail. In the late 1920s, the police tried to evict her, deport her again. She was working for Arcos, the Soviet trade delegation in London, which was seen as a centre of Soviet espionage. And an MI5 agent cottoned on. It was the same person. They tried very hard to deport her. Don't know quite how, but she managed to stay, and she was living in Brick Lane until her death in the 1960s. I was going to say something about the anarchist movement more generally, but I've run out of time. But that's the story of the Siege of Sidney Street. Tomorrow morning I'm doing a walk as part of the Hackney History Festival. You can book, I think there are still places. It starts at 10 o'clock. I have some copies of my book, which is very reasonably priced at £15, and it's a hardback and it's illustrated. And you can have a signed copy, though some people say the unsigned copies are more valuable. But thank you very much for your attention. And we do have some time for questions if anybody has a question.
Right. Well, there's two questions really. First of all, I want to know about the people that were living around, because my grandfather lived 2 doors away from the siege in 1911. And I know when the film was shown, and my grandmother ran out to look at the film on TV, and I was young, and I said to her, "What was he doing there?" And she said, "He was probably throwing bricks at the police." And that was her answer. I don't know whether that would be true or a bit about family stuff. And the second one was that there's a lot of rumours that Peter the Painter himself was a Russian agent. Is there any truth in that?
Okay.
So I want to know about people around.
Right. So Peter the Painter, it's a marvellous sort of political pseudonym, isn't it? Actually devised unwittingly by the London police to identify him from other Peters who were involved. He was a painter, an industrial painter. But Peter the Painter, that alliterative nickname, is what makes him remembered, plus the fact that it clearly bears an echo of that other East End anti-hero, Jack the Ripper. The conventional story is that the police have no idea who Jack the Ripper was, and they have no idea who Peter the Painter was. The police actually did find out who Peter the Painter was. By the end of 1912, they knew he was a guy called Janis Saklis. They knew where the family farm was in Latvia. They didn't know where he was, and they certainly knew he wasn't in Britain, but they had no evidence to extradite or convict, so they basically didn't try very hard. Was he a Russian agent? There are lots of theories, one of which was actually perpetrated by Rudolf Rocker, who said, Peter the Painter, he went on to work for the Soviet secret police. That's not right. It was another guy called Jacob Peters, who was also on the fringes of the group, who went to be the number 2 in the Cheka, the Soviet secret police. There's no real evidence that Peter the Painter was a Russian agent. But the Russian consul here would certainly have tried to have agents who were able to inform on this group. So it's not absolutely impossible that there was an agent operating somewhere in the group. As for Sidney Street, so This particular block, 4-storey houses that had only been built about a decade earlier, they were rather solid. This block has now been demolished, but further south on Sidney Street, there are blocks of very much the same type and date, red brick blocks. 100 Sidney Street, the main tenant was a family who had their own tailoring business, and they used the loft as a sort of warehouse, and they sublet. And Betsy Gershon, who had the second floor room, she also, I mean, she a rather strange story. She had a son, but the son was a baby but didn't live with her, and her husband was somewhere in Eastern Europe, and she also worked at a tailoring factory. I mean, the rag trade was the defining, not the only, but the defining industry of the East End. The other people who were there, most of them recent migrants, so people who had come probably as adults from Eastern Europe. A lot of them had their own businesses, but if you look at the census returns for 1911, all the shops locally are run by people from Eastern Europe. The fried fish shop, the little cafe across the road. The only exceptions are, well, the pubs in particular. One or two of the sort of cafes are clearly run by people whose names suggest they're not Jewish, and the pubs as well seem to have had mainly non-Jewish publicans, though the Rising Sun, the guy who charged the money to the journalist to get to the roof, he was a Jewish migrant. Bill.
Thank you, Andrew. That was terrific. The only time I hear about Latvians in London is Latvian anarchists around this time. So my question is just simply, were there any other Latvians who weren't anarchists?
Yeah, there were Latvian Marxists. So the Eastern European population of London at this time would have been in 6 figures, you know, low 6 figures. So we're talking about 120,000 migrants from Eastern Europe. Latvia was very small. It's got a population of 2 million now. Actually, it had a slightly larger population in 1911. It's been one of its main exports. I mean, in many ways, rather sadly, has been young people. And that's continuing as Latvia's member of the European Union. How big was the Latvian population in London? That's a very good question, and I don't know. There was an active and above ground, so to speak, Latvian social democratic organisation. There were Latvians who worked near Glasgow, both in coal mines and in the, what other industries? In the ironworks there. But I suspect the Latvian community was very, very small. I don't think there was any Latvian émigré paper, for example. And I didn't get any impression that the Latvians I'm talking about, who weren't in London all that long, Nina Vasileva had been in London for 4 or 5 years, but she had been here longer than any of the others. I don't get the impression that they socialised with other non-political Latvians. Can I take one more?
Very, very quick.
There were Lenin and Stalin were both present in London before the First World War, and Stalin used to arrange robberies, bank robberies, to the Bolsheviks. Was there any connection between the Bolsheviks and these anarchists?
Well, the one-word answer is no, but Jacob Peters, who was part of the gang, who insisted he wasn't, who was said to be part of the gang, who insisted he wasn't an anarchist, he was a member of the British Socialist Party, which was the mainstream socialist party, and he later became a Bolshevik. So distant, I'd have to say, but I think I'll have to leave it at that. But thank you very much.